Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sally, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Andie Tucher presenting her new book, Not Exactly Lying, Fake News and Fake Journalism in American History. She will be joined in conversation tonight by Kathy Forde. Thank you so much for joining us virtually this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues this spring, bringing authors and their work to our community and our digital community. Find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can disable the captions there as well. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Not Exactly Lying on harvard.com. Your purchases truly make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you all for tuning in and purchasing books from Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Historian and journalist Andie Tucher is the H. Gordon Garbedian Professor and the Director of the Communications PhD program at the Columbia Journalism School. She is also the author of Froth and Scum, Truth, Beauty, Goodness, and the Axe Murder in America's First Mass Medium, Happily Sometimes After, Discovering Stories from the 12 Generations of an American Family, and other works on the evolution of the conventions of truth-telling in journalism, photography, personal narrative, and other nonfiction forms. Kathy Forde is an American journalism historian with research interests in democracy and the public sphere, the Black freedom struggle in the press, the First Amendment, literary journalism, and the history of the book and print culture. She is the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Massachusetts. They'll be discussing Andie's newest book, Not Exactly Lying, Fake News and Fake Journalism in American History. Long before the current preoccupation with fake news, American newspapers routinely ran stories that were not quite strictly speaking true. Today, a firm boundary between fact and fakery is a hallmark of journalistic practice, yet for many readers and publishers across more than 3 centuries, this distinction has seemed slippery or even irrelevant. Tucher explores how American audiences have argued over what's real and what's not, and why that matters for democracy. We're so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. The digital podium is yours, Andie and Kathy.
Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Sally.
Andie, I'm so happy to be here with you speaking about your new book. I know you've been working on this for a while.
Yes, I have.
And I think you began working on it. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you began working on it before the era of social media, fake news, and then, of course, Trump's use of the term fake news. And so, I always love to hear the story of how authors become interested in particular subjects, how they turn those subjects into books. And so I'm hoping you can share with me and everyone tuning in this evening, how you came to this subject and what about it seemed to you to be appropriate for a book.
Thanks, Kathy. And I'm so pleased to be here with you. Thank you for being here. I think I've been writing this book all my life. I've always been interested in journalism and the conventions that developed that made journalism be true, how journalists persuaded the public that they were telling the truth, what the rules and conventions were. But you can't look at the rules and conventions of truth-telling without also noticing how many times there is so much that is not true. And it really struck me. And when I began, my first research was looking in the era of the 1830s and 40s in the mass press in New York. And it seemed that the press was full of stories that weren't true, but it also seemed nobody cared because nobody expected them to be true. And I began to wonder, when did it become understood that if you opened a newspaper, everything in it would be true. And it didn't, that wasn't that for the first 200 years or so of American journalism, that was not the convention. So I was intrigued to see the various ways that truth and fiction, truth and tall tales, truth and hoaxes and humbugs all mixed together, tangled together, and how people responded to that. Why was it they were perfectly willing to accept newspapers that had stuff in it that weren't true?
We're going to come back to this humbug
Yeah.
a little bit. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how you open the book. I found it to be intriguing. So when I teach long form narrative, serious nonfiction writing with a journalistic bent, I spend a lot of time with my students looking closely at the openings of some of the great works of long form narrative. So, we think Hiroshima in Cold Blood, like some of the early works, but, more recently, for example, we spend a lot of time looking at Nicole Hannah-Jones' opening in Segregation Now, that really spectacular long form piece she wrote about segregation in America, the resegregation of public education in America. And so I always think that the openings, really the best openings, and you do this so brilliantly in all of your work, and I do think I have read all of your work. Best openings really make vivid and in compelling and nuanced ways the topic. And you open with this quotation from Donald Trump, in which he takes a credit. He's not only calls the media fake, he also takes credit for this term, which you make clear to all of us. The fake news is not new term with Donald Trump. But then you open with that quotation, and then you move to the scene in the Columbia Journalism School where you teach, and are the director of PhD in communication, everybody. Andie, I thought that must be really fun for you to tell a story about your own institution, but you open with the son of Joseph Pulitzer in the first year the school is opened in 1912, talking to journalism students and talking to them about fakery in news. So just tell us about why you opened there, and how did you come to that opening? What kind of work are you expecting it to do for the book, and for your own thinking about the history of fake news?
Oh, those are great questions. This is Ralph Pulitzer, who really wanted to improve the reputation of his father's newspaper. The New York World it was in many ways a spectacular paper. It was important, it was influential, it was dedicated to the common good. His great rival, William Randolph Hearst, also had a sensational paper, but Hearst never had the same kind of concern for public life that Pulitzer did. But Pulitzer made his name doing news that was kind of sensational, that was kind of yellow, that sometimes stepped over lines. And I think it was in part his remorse over the excesses that he countenanced during the coverage of the Spanish-American War of 1898 that made him decide he had to found a journalism school. So Ralph came along, the son came along, and really wanted to make journalism something that was respectable and reputable, which is, of course, something that anybody teaching at the journalism school is going to admire and value. So I found a little pamphlet, 12-page pamphlet that printed his opening statement, his opening address to the class of 80 or so students in 1912. And he was so passionate about it. He was so gripping in his absolute insistence that there is no such thing as harmless faking. A faker is a liar, and a faker who the point of a newspaper is to tell the truth, and if you don't tell the truth, you are committing a perverted and monstrosity. And it was so committed to the idea that journalism can be such a tool for wisdom and enlightenment and information and the public good. And that's an idea that has become so, I don't know, people are so dismissive of the whole possibility that journalism is something that has honor and has nobility and has good aspirations. I was so taken by Ralph's commitment to that seemed a place where I really needed to push. And it also gave me a good place to stand to push back against. I mean, here's Trump saying I made up fake, and 100 years before that, it was very much a part of the dialogue. So it was a little bit of a poke at him too. A little bit.
Speaking of that, what was it like? I mean, because this book you've been researching this history for quite a while. And so, then along comes Trump.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm just wondering what your you were deep into writing this book, and then along comes, a presidential administration that is demonizing the press and is using fake news in a very particular kind of way. I mean, even before Trump, there was, a lot of talk of fake news and social media, right? And a lot of concern about the circulation of fake news through, through social media sites, through people, maybe bots, maybe trolls, troll farms, et cetera. And then your grandmother, I think, as you put in your
yes, her too.
Point. But so what was it like for you as a historian, as you're working on this project, to go, oh my gosh, I'm working on this project, and now we are living in this moment where it's incredibly, I mean, I think in journalism, it's always been this topic incredibly important, but now it seems like top of mind for so many people.
Yeah. It was a little frightening and a little astonishing. I mean, for all the reasons that many people were frightened and astonished by the Trump administration, but also it seemed to take the whole idea of fakery and hackery in newspapers. It seemed to take the dismissiveness toward journalism to a place I had not expected it could go. It seemed so excessive, the animosity toward the press, the demonization of the press, and it's in some places the response by the press itself was not covering itself with glory in some areas during those years too. I felt like, I was at a beach and a great wave was about to wash over me and smash me on the sand when I began to think about how this was a culmination of a long history that had just pushed farther than anybody could have expected.
Well, toward the end of our conversation, maybe we can return to that and talk about how you end the book. Really powerful ending. But maybe a good next move is for us to talk a little bit about the definitional challenges, right? You're writing about, so first of all, fake news itself is this really slippery protean term in our own moment. And it's also not a term that emerged de novo, right, during the Trump era or during the social media era. And so as you explain in the introduction so beautifully, there's a history in U.S. journalism from the colonial era, from the very first colonial newspaper experiences, all the way up to the present moment of purposeful fakery, of the spreading of untruths, whether purposeful or not. And so there's just this fake news is, just as a shorthand here, it changes in news itself, what constitutes news, what we take to be journalism, and who we take to be a journalist, and what we take to be a news report. All of these things change across the U.S. Experience. And so as you're dealing with this topic across different eras of press history, just this definitional issue, I thought, how is she going to do this? And you do it really well. So I thought maybe you could explain to those who are tuning in tonight a little bit about how you define fake news variously, but in ways that are really rooted in history and in our present moment too.
Yeah, sure. The term faking became very much a part of the debate over what journalism should be. The actual word, the term faking, in around the 1880s and 90s, which is one of the things that surprised me when I began my research here. It was before that, nobody really used the term, but before that, journalism was a mess, and a lot of it was bad, and a lot of it didn't care that it was bad, and some of it was very good. But the purpose of journalism from up until the 1880s, from the beginning in 1690, was as a consumer good that gave people lots of stuff, and there weren't a lot of other outlets of print for much of that era for many people living in America in various places. So a newspaper had just lots of things in it, some of them true, some of them not. Around the 1880s, 1890s, you had two separate strands diverging. On the one side were the sensational papers, the entertainment papers, the small town papers that didn't have a lot of resources. And they wanted to attract readers with whatever it took. On the other side were more serious newspapers who were starting to feel that they were being damaged by the reputation of these other ones who were just, doing stuff. And they decided, they felt it was important to try to clean up journalism, to make it fulfill the obligations and responsibilities that had always been attached to it. This is where the term fake comes into the dialogue. And the jolly papers, the yellow papers, they talk about faking as something that's fun. I love to fake, said some trade journals. I really love to fake. It's fun. People won't care. It gives them a better story. It doesn't hurt anybody. They'll like it. I like it. It gives me a chance to exercise my creativity. So there's, on the one hand, all of these newspapers talking about what fun it was to fake. And on the other hand, you have papers. New York Times was one of the leading in that era, where they said faking is a terrible thing, and we're going to stamp it out. We're going to not countenance it. We are going to call out newspapers that do it. So in a way, professionalized, objective journalism with conventions and standards and rules was born out of the response to the newspapers that faked. Objectivity was invented to stamp out faking, if you want to put it in simple terms.
Yeah. And you have a really interesting argument about objectivity in the present as well. And we'll return to that toward the end of our conversation as well. You tell some stories in this book from the early colonial experience about Benjamin Harris and Public Occurrences and John Campbell and the Boston Newsletter, about, you didn't call it fake news, but this is, spreading of untruths, and it's unclear, and certainly with Benjamin Harris, whether he was spreading an untruth purposefully or not. But the thing about these stories is these are legendary stories that anyone who teaches journalism history knows, and that anyone who takes a journalism history course knows. And those of you tuning in tonight, you may or may not know about the very first newspaper, Benjamin Harris and Public Occurrences, but Andie has a great story to tell about it. It was news to me, and it's going to forever change the way I teach. The story of the first newspaper. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about it, and why it's, it was such a vivid way to start once you get past the introduction in your book, into, really laying out across a long period of time the history of fake news.
This was a great story, I found too. And as you say, it was something I had known for years. It begins in 1690 when Benjamin Harris comes over from London, where he has been in trouble with the religious wars in England, and he has to flee. He comes to Boston. There have been newspapers that come on aboard ship. People in Boston have seen newspapers before, but there's never been a domestically produced newspaper at home in Boston, the most important city of the colonies at the time. And Benjamin Harris comes and he says, I'm going to set up a newspaper. So how is he going to make people believe him? Here's somebody, a stranger coming to town saying, I'm going to tell you the truth. Well, he prints his first newspaper, and he has a kind of a mission statement at the top. And he says, I'm going to do the following things. I'm going to give you all the news about God's providence, which is a very important way to think about how you look at what's newsworthy in a society that is deeply religiously based. I'm going to give you information you need so you can prosper in your businesses. And that's always smart too, because newspapers never flourish without the support of people with money. I'm going to find false reports. I'm going to go only to the sources to the best sources for my information. And if I find out anything is false, I'm going to tell. I'm going to expose the tellers of the false reports. And this all sounds kind of wonderfully modern and very responsible. I'm going to do these right things. I'm going to get the right news. You can trust me. He says, look me in the eyes. You can trust me. And then the first newspaper comes out, and it has a bunch of stuff in it. It's got things about fires and epidemics, and then, the suicide of a melancholy widower, and a piece about the King of France. King Louis XIV of France. He's in trouble with his son, says the newspaper, because he's sleeping with his daughter-in-law. And this has always been seen as, oh my God, it's too scandalous. This is why the newspaper was shut down. Well, no, because it occurred to me to look up and see what I could find out about the King of France's daughter-in-law. And much to my surprise, he didn't have one. So that was pretty clear to me that this was a piece of, it was deceptive news, how fake it is. I think what happened, there had been a daughter-in-law who had died long ago. I think what was going on there, this is my guess because, I can't look into Benjamin Harris's head, but Harris was a committed Protestant. Louis XIV of France was a papist who had returned to the persecution of Protestants. They had been on hold for a while and he was persecuting them again. I think Harris found this very troubling. I think Harris used what has become a classic maneuver of fake news by choosing a story that sounded just plausible enough, because everyone knew King Louis of France had been a libertine. He wasn't anymore. He had married again. He was being nice. But they knew that about him. They knew he was a papist. They knew he was a foreign king. So they were perfectly willing to believe a story that undermined his authority and made him look bad. And I think that's what Benjamin Harris calculated. So by looking into what was behind the story, I was able to figure out that even the very first newspaper in what became America was using this tactic.
And it only made it for one issue.
One issue. It got stamped out. And in part because it was saying rude things about a king, even though he was an enemy king, he was rude. I mean, he was a king who was appointed by divine right. He also hadn't gotten permission from the authorities, which was required.
Yeah. So for everyone, the very first newspapers in this country were licensed, which of course, today is anathema. Can't even imagine such a thing because of the First Amendment and what we understand to be a kind of, the prohibition against prior restraint or any kind of government interference with the press. But that's not how the colonial experience began, that's for sure. So I'm going to kind of skip forward over the revolutionary period and talk about the early republic, and how your book, how you explore this period of intense partisanship in our country, and which also at the same time, we had deeply, deeply partisan press. And my students always find this really interesting because so many of them, certainly today, think, oh my gosh, we are living in our own period of deep polarization, of deep partisan divides, and a press that seems partisan as well. And they're surprised to learn, many of them are surprised to learn that the early Republican era, we had very kind of viciously partisan press, very actively partisan. And so can you tell us how this period, in which there's often this incredibly vicious political rhetoric and some untruths and disinformation being actively spread for political purposes in the press, how that's important in this history that you tell about fake news? And maybe, I don't know whether it helps us think in new ways about our own moment, if you have anything to say there too.
No, my students have the same problem with it. They are stunned when they read, for instance, the doggerel poem that was published in a Boston newspaper about the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in days when he was very powerful. He was an enormously powerful person in the new government. He was not yet the hero of a rap musical. And here is a poem published in a Boston newspaper that talks, it uses words like lewd slave of lust, monstrous, besotted by whores. It's really incredibly ugly. But what's going on here is that this is a new country that is founded, it's a democratic republic, and there is no precedent for it that people can see surviving at the same time. Nobody knows how it's going to work. Nobody knows how to make it happen. The Constitution has laid out a form of government which does not allow for political parties because no one thought the political parties were necessary or even desirable. The idea was that newspapers would give people the information they needed to make decisions that were good for the democracy. And newspapers would therefore essential part of the work of democracy. But they would simply provide the information. People would read them. They would discuss it. They would come to conclusions. They would agree. Everything would be fine. It was shocking for the American public to realize that they didn't agree, and that there were things that they were arguing about: big government versus small government, what taxation and who should run taxation. The same kind of issues that are at the core of a lot of disagreements now. And so newspapers became not the place where you got calm, reasoned, enlightened information about what's going on. Newspapers became the cockpit of the fight, where they were providing acrimony and attack rather than information. And they just, as so often happened, they ratcheted it up. They just, they in a spiral, an ascending spiral of ugliness and partisan vituperation, until just a decade after the Constitution said Congress shall make no law regarding freedom of the press, Congress made a law regarding a freedom of the press, this Alien and Sedition Act, which made it a crime to say things that cast the government in disrepute. But what they were trying to do, they were learning how to make a democratic republic work. They were figuring out how to carry out public debate in a safe place that would be responsive to people's needs. That's a hard thing to do. We haven't solved that yet. And they didn't know that, that it was a hard thing to do that wasn't going to be solved. But it was not a period that reflects well on the press or the public either.
Did when you were writing that section, and I mean, we all teach it, but also when you're writing about it in the way that you were, and thinking about the messiness of democracy and the role of the news in democracy in the public, and as you were thinking, as you were kind of revisiting that moment, were you thinking at all about our own moment and the political divide in our own moment? And was there any takeaway for you? Did you find any solace in the fact that, well, we got through that, maybe we'll get through this as well?
I try. It's inevitable that for a historian to be looking into the past, exploring the past, there are always going to be echoes and resonances and familiarities. So yeah, it's inevitable. And sometimes I think, well, good thing I'm a historian, because then all I have to do is like study it. I don't have to solve it. I don't have to figure out what to do with it. There are lots of moments like that where things get really bad. And one of my comforts is that things get really bad and then they turn around. They come to a point where people realize, we got to stop this. This is too much. This is a bridge too far. This is not working. I keep waiting for us to get to that place now. It's taking longer than anybody could have expected or hoped, but there are cycles and things do change. So
we'll try to be hopeful.
Yeah.
So during the penny press era, you write about James Gordon Bennett. You write about his incredibly colorful and inventive coverage of the murder and subsequent criminal trial for the murderers of Ellen Jewett, who was a prostitute at the time. And he used this, his story, this was incredibly competitive. He launched a real competitive news story in which a lot of the penny papers were going after this story. And, it's a media circus of one of the first, I guess, media circuses we have.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that story? Because it's so formative, it seems to me. And if we think about the history of fake news, and also at a moment where we're shifting from, you've got the first commercial press really emerge, and newspapers are trying out new things. It's a period of great invention and innovation. And James Gordon Bennett is one of the great innovators, right, of that period. This is where we get the emergence of the reporter, the emergence of the interview. Yeah. So in news practice, my students are always like, what? The interview had to be invented? What?
Yeah. And it was called contemptible. It was a contemptible practice.
And the Europeans hated it. They thought we were just barbarians. Can you talk about that moment a little bit?
Yeah, this was one of the moments where the the bitter partisanship of the press starts to subside in a way, in part because the penny press comes along with a new business model. It is not interested in doing political argumentation. It is not interested in being beholden to the fortunes of a political party. Newspapers before that, in the partisan era, were funded by political parties. They were edited by political partisans, which also meant that if your party lost, if your party disappeared, which sometimes happened in that era, you could be out of work. It also was a more elite audience. It was never going to be a large audience. It was never going to be profitable. So in the 1830s, an era of more opportunity, greater opportunity, somewhat more democratization and egalitarianism in society, although clearly still many people were left out. But it was opening up more for ordinary white men who could take part in society. Penny editors began to look for a different model, and they came to the conclusion that if they just sold a newspaper that was really popular and people liked, and sold it cheap enough that everybody could afford it, and had advertisers who would be willing to advertise in the paper to all of the people who could afford to buy it, that might work. And in fact, it did. Here was a commercial press based on pleasing the consumer. But immediately there was enormous competition. James Gordon Bennett at the Herald was perhaps the loudest and best known of them, but there were a number of others as well. And one of the ways they distinguished themselves was seizing on the same story and covering it in different ways and taking different points of view. So James Gordon Bennett looked at the murder of the prostitute and the accused young man, Richard Robinson, was accused of having killed her during a visit. And he said, Richard Robinson is a poor, young, friendless man who has no power at all, and he's being framed by this vicious madam and corrupt police, and he's a good kid. And on the other side, you had the New York Sun, which was saying, oh no, this is a completely different thing. This is a rich kid who has influential friends, and they're buying the justice that they prefer because he's guilty as sin. So they fought and ratcheted up again. And there was lots of fake stuff, fake letters allegedly written by the murdered woman, fake diaries allegedly written by the young man. I think what was going on here again, they're inventing how you report and tell news stories. Real, actual news stories rather than political argumentation. Nobody had covered a crime with that kind of passion before. But they also were trying to gain their audiences, to inveigle audiences, people who had never before considered newspapers important to their daily life and their well-being. And they wanted to make them read them. So they told stories that were sensational, that were interesting, but also that were inviting these new readers to make their own choices about what they believed. You could choose to buy the newspaper that said that the young man was being framed. You could choose to buy the newspaper that said that the young woman had been an outcast of society who was being exploited. It didn't really matter. You could actually believe or not how true the story was, but you could support with your pennies the newspaper that told you what you wanted to believe was true. And I think everybody had an idea that, it's a little exaggerated, it's a little bold, but they also understood that this was a new kind of newspaper that was going to tell stories that were interesting to people.
Yeah, that makes me think that, there they were selling, busily selling their papers, building profits based on, and building their readerships based on the stories that they, you could then choose up sides, right? Mm-hmm. Confirmation bias. And of course, that's part of our landscape today, right? Where this is not about entertainment. This is about today when we're making choices between MSNBC or Fox News. It's often political commitments and social identities that are deeply, deeply rooted in these political identities. And a little bit later, I would love to get to some of what you have to say about deep story, the deep story that that Fox News in particular has created for some of its viewers and why that matters in the history that you tell. But before we do, let's shift a little bit to like the late 19th, early 20th century. Mm-hmm. So during this moment, you've got the rise of, mass newspapers, right? Yeah. With Pulitzer and Hearst. We've talked about that a little bit. You've got yellow journalism, and big urban papers experimenting and building out new forms of news work and new formats for doing journalism. But you also, in the South, you have certain white urban newspapers that are trucking in disinformation in order to serve the goals of white supremacy. And you tell the story of the North Carolina election of 1898 and the Wilmington massacre and the role of the Raleigh News and Observer and its white newspaper publisher, Josephus Daniels, in spreading disinformation about crime or supposed Black male crime against white women. Can you talk just a little bit about that? Because that's a very different kind of disinformation or fake news or spreading of untruths for very particular kinds of purposes.
Yeah, no, this is an area you've done a lot of work in too. I know that. The Wilmington coup, it was, some historians have called it the first successful coup in American history. It was took place in Wilmington in North Carolina, which was at the time had a multiracial town administration, and Democrats, white supremacists, local people were horrified at the interracial nature of this, and fomented a rebellion in effect that overturned an election, drove the elected officials out. But the newspaper, Josephus Daniels had a comment in his autobiography that was just stunning, where his newspaper was one of the ones, as you said, that just upheld white supremacy in all possible ways with false stories, many of them telling false stories about crimes committed by Black men. And what Josephus Daniels said in his journal years later was, we never really, people would come to us with these stories and we would play them up in big type. We never really looked into them at all. And you could see he thought this was just fine. It was very breezy. It was not a mea culpa. It was, that's how it worked. So that I found really shocking. The Atlanta Constitution was very scathing about the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett, the pioneering investigative reporter who did elaborate work proving that most of the crimes against Black men, which were laid to their attacking white women, they were completely untrue. And the Atlanta Constitution used the word fake journalism about Ida B. Wells and what she's in this investigation, that she found the truth. So yeah, there was a lot going on there where sometimes faking you can read about, and it doesn't sound terribly harmful. But in this case, the concerted effort by these newspapers to present a vision of the society that was completely false is really stunning.
Yeah, and the Black press pushing against it the whole time. Trying to get and documenting. I mean, Ida B. Wells did document lynching. Well, Justice Initiative today has relied so much on her work and the work of other really important Black journalists and leaders of that period. So there's this shift. This shift in the early 20th century. You talked about the emergence of the objectivity standard. Post World War I, in reaction to U.S. propagandizing, in reaction to the professionalization project of journalism, which is all part of not only the broader professionalization of a lot of different areas of work, spheres of work in American public life, but also a way to push to discipline journalism, right? Make journalism standard, to push back against the yellow journalism, to make journalism central to the democratic project. And so there's this shift, as you point out, in the early 20th century, from placing the burden on the reader to determine what's true in all this stuff that I'm reading. And now that burden is on the newspaper. It's on the institutions of journalism to deliver the truth. And the reader then becomes, or the consumer is someone who, you expect truth. In pages of the newspaper or magazines, and then later, the other forms. There's all this boundary work being done too by journalists. Like, I'm a journalist, you're not a journalist. This is what journalism is. This is what journalism isn't. And this policing of the boundaries. And why is that important in the history of fake news? That moment.
Yeah, I think this is the invention of what I call fake journalism, which is a very different thing than fake news. Fake news can come from all sorts of other places. Fake news can come through social media, through pop culture. Fake journalism takes the tenets and conventions and boundaries and strictures of real journalism, which were invented in order to push back against fake, and it exploits them. It uses them in a false way by pretending to follow the conventions and the ethics. It steals the credibility of real journalism while presenting stories that are either highly opinionated or untrue and are presented as if they were objective and verified. And I think fake journalism is more a concern now than fake news. I think fake journalism is much more dangerous to public life.
Maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe this is a good segue to talking about Fox News and what you say about Fox News. So you write in your book that Fox News practices fake journalism as a cover for its real work of partisan journalism or partisan activism. Mm-hmm. And when you make that claim, you then, instead of, I was like, oh my God, she's going to talk about the 2020 election, you talk about the 2000 election of President Bush. And then you give a really robust history of what Fox News is doing in its really cozy relationship with the Bush administration, starting, well, maybe with the very beginning of the Bush administration on. And then you discuss how Fox News insisted the whole time that it's straight news, that it is fair and balanced. And but in reality, it's operating as this covert wing of the Republican Party, building what sociologist Arlie Hochschild, how do we say her last name?
I would say Hochschild.
Hochschild has called a deep story, the story that feels as if it were true, and that this deep story does a certain kind of work for Fox News. Can you just talk? I mean, that argument is fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think readers of your book and listeners here today are going to be really interested to hear.
Yeah. Well, Arlie Hochschild did some really interesting work on that, and I draw on her work. Fox News is Roger Ailes founded Fox News in a really clever way. He said, he didn't say we are going to fight against liberal journalists by becoming conservative journalists. He said, we're going to fight against all of those who are untrue by being the only ones who are true. We are fair, we are balanced, we are objective. They're not. But what that means is, if we're true and fair and balanced, they're not normal. They're worthy of being dismissed. We are doing the real journalism. But what it does, you mentioned the 2000 election. That was an election in which George W. Bush ends up, as many of you will remember, the Supreme Court ends up deciding the decision because the count in Florida is very upsetting and erratic and difficult to organize. And there's lots of contention over what ballots are valid and what ballots are not. And the back and forth, it went back and forth for a number. The person who Fox News hired to run their decision desk was the first cousin of George W. Bush. And there's no reputable news organization that would hire a close relative of a presidential candidate to run the news desk where numbers are crunched and projections are being fielded. But this was seen as perfectly normal for Fox News, because even though it was calling itself and allowing people to perpetuate the illusion that they're getting the truth. They're allowed to believe that it's the truth because it's using the language of journalism to say we are telling you the truth and we're being fair and objective and balanced, and it was not. So it's a story that resonates with people. Hochschild's book talks about how Fox News is seen as family. Fox News tells you what to think and what not to think, and it operates almost like almost like, not her words but mine, a church, where people can feel that, here I'm getting the truth. I'm getting, there's biblical inerrancy here, and what I'm getting is making me happy and satisfied and fulfilled because they understand who I am. But it's a swath of the population, a very small, relatively small swath, but it is so coherent, cohesive in its attitude toward Fox News.
Yeah, and somehow Fox News has created this deep story about identity that who Fox viewers are, relationship to Fox News. So you also write in your conclusion that we should recognize value in straightforward, objective journalism. I mean, objective journalism has been it's been critiqued robustly for 50 years now, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. As long as there's Bennett. Yeah.
Yeah. And it still feels kind of like new to different generations. And the critique is somehow new. I mean, but the critique changes. The critique does change shape and change form across time. But you write that the reason we should recognize the value in straightforward objective journalism today is because objective journalism is what the fake journalists so vigorously pretend to be doing. I hope everyone heard that. I mean, that's just, it matters because objective journalism is what fake journalists so vigorously pretend to be doing. Can you explain? I mean, dig into that a little bit.
Yeah. There's, as you say, there's a lot of pushback against objectivity, and many mainstream news organizations that for a long time base their identity in professionalized objective values are moving away from them a little bit. There's a strong critique that says that objective journalism simply validates what is seen to be the neutral viewpoint is actually white male dominance, and it's not diverse. It doesn't recognize diversity. It simply parrots dominant values and reinforces them. You know, an important critique. Yes. The idea that subjectivity is inevitable, therefore you should embrace it. You should, simply be transparent about being subjective rather than saying that. My anxiety there is that even as the mainstream journalists are saying, we can't really know what the truth is, everything is subjective. Even as mainstream journalists are saying that, the Fox Newses of the world are saying, we got it down. We know what we're talking about. We're telling you the truth. We are objective. We are fair and balanced. And here's the mainstream saying, oh, I'm not, I'm going to acknowledge my own subjectivity. It's a rigged debate. It's not going to work that way. It gives the opinionated empire that presents itself as objective. It gives them the way that they can say we're the ones who have the truth, and the others are simply giving their own opinion. And it's hard to argue against that when the mainstream press is saying, truth is contingent and it's all subjective. It's a real tension there.
Yeah, it really is. So we've got questions coming in.
Okay.
I have got plenty more questions I could ask you, but I think it's only fair that everyone who's viewing is here to see you and they want to ask questions too. So let me, we've got a question from Megan Marshall. Wonderful program. Can Andie say something about how the press can or should handle false information put out by government leaders? Trump's many lies, Representative Lisa McCain's recent claim that Trump had caught Osama bin Laden. Is there a history that we can learn from, or is this uncharted territory?
Oh, Megan, thank you for the question. False information put out by the government. There has been so much of that. There's been so much of that in the guise of fake journalism. The famous example is the CIA that was setting up a fake news organization, a fake news agency to plant news in international newspapers that were favorable to the United States. And there was a congressional hearing into that. Newspaper editors came and said, you cannot do this. You cannot cast doubt on, you cannot exploit the trust of journalists for your purposes. The CIA was completely uninterested in hearing this and said, well, the journalists always lie anyway. It doesn't matter. The cynicism was breathtaking. There is very little to do, that I know of, but you can't stop doing it. I mean, the newspapers and the congressional hearing challenged the CIA, publicized it, tried to make an effort to explain why this is so damaging. But institutions of power have their own momentum.
Well said. So we've got another question. First with a comment. Thank you so much for being here. Was there, and this is from someone anonymous, Lee asking, was there anything you wanted to include in the book that you ultimately had to leave out?
Oh my! I have an enormous file of documents that I'm trying to think now. There were one of the things I wanted to do more of was to figure out how to give journalism credit for when it did do good work, because one of my fears in this book is it's going to catastrophize journalism and make it easy to dismiss it because look, all of this fake stuff. That's not my intention, and I would be really sorry if that happened. And I would have liked to have had more opportunity to have more to say more about what journalism has done that has worked and that has been public, good for the public and ideal and based on ideals.
There are so many books about that too, though. And
yeah,
it just as a little bit of solace, perhaps.
Okay, I'll take that.
That has been the mythology. I mean, and I don't mean mythology as in a false story about journalism, but we know quite a bit about those histories, and thank goodness for them. And it's and we do those are. It's an important tradition in American journalism. So we have another question from someone it's an anonymous question. I've been hearing and reading a lot about disinformation, especially over the last few years, like Kathy just mentioned. What kinds of people do you find to be most susceptible to disinformation, and why? I don't know if you did any kind of reader studies in your your work.
I didn't do reader studies. I read a lot of scholarly studies exploring that question. So I can only speak on secondhand. There are a lot of, there's a cluster of qualities that many people who fall for disinformation share, but a lot of it depends on what the disinformation is and what it deals with. In the current climate, we can see a lot of disinformation about vaccines, a lot of disinformation about who won the election, whether the election was stolen, and in those cases, there are statistical portraits of the kind of people who believe that. They are often people who feel not part of mainstream life, who feel that their opinions and their goals and their values are dismissed by elites or people in power. And this is one way to push back against that, by resisting the information that comes from elites and people in power.
Yeah, I think that might get to the book you were talking about earlier, the Arlie Hochschild, Strangers in Their Own Land.
Yes.
Anger and Mourning on the American Right. I think that would be one additional place to look for some information about that. Another question. Hello. This is anonymous as well. Hello. Thanks, Harvard Books and Andie and Kathy, for putting on this talk. Do you believe as though journalism has more power in the U.S. than it does elsewhere? If you prefer, what role does power play in the fake journalism, fake news conversation?
What role does power play in the? I don't know a lot about what I would call fake news or fake journalism in other countries. That's a tough question. Whether journalism has more power in the U.S. journalism has lots of power in the world because it is so it's so widely distributed. You can find it in so many places, in so many parts of the world. People know about it, even if they don't follow it. So it's more influential, I think, on a wider swath of the population. It's also in English, and English is so widely read. So there's simply a technical and logistical advantage that U.S. journalism has. It's also, there is a lot, though. Media companies in the U.S. can be very powerful. Media companies, as parts of large corporations, share the corporate power, and that's something that often concerns people who believe that journalism ought to be as independent as possible. So the power there is something to be concerned about. Maybe not. There are specific examples that we could bring up. It's not always an issue, but it's something to keep in your mind. Well,
certainly the role of the Raleigh News and Observer in 1898 in quashing of Black political participation, and then ultimately disenfranchising Black voters. That's one news, just one newspaper's power.
Yeah.
In a historical moment. Here's an interesting question, and I didn't. This question brings up MSNBC, which you do write about in the book. This is from someone anonymously. You talked about Fox News and what they are doing. Can you give us your impression of MSNBC?
Yeah, MSNBC, Fox was founded just 3 months after MSNBC was, and they've always been head to head. MSNBC struggled in its early years to figure out what its identity was going to be. And in fact, it had hired people like Ann Coulter and Oliver North in its earliest years. It eventually settled on generally presenting itself and embracing the identity of a more liberal left-wing opinion network. But it's been a little bit schizophrenic, because as its corporate parent being NBC, it tries to, or it understands it needs to acknowledge the values of a professional news organization. There are sometimes clashes between the opinion side and the news side on MSNBC. Fox doesn't have the same sensitivity about the division between opinion and news. They blend and they bleed a little bit more, and they don't follow. For instance, MSNBC, Keith Olbermann had got into trouble for donating money to a political campaign. Fox doesn't have that kind of, or didn't at the time have that kind of prohibition. So there are, I think, MSNBC owns its advocacy and its opinion a little more openly, which can get it into tangles with the news division. Fox kind of denies those boundaries.
Thank you for that. It's a great part of the book too, by the way, everyone. And by the way, everyone needs to know Andie is a beautiful writer.
Thank you, Kathy.
Writer that you are, and everyone should know this book is eminently readable. It's a joy to read. So we've got another comment from a question from Joseph Ben Simon. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Joseph. Your comments on objectivity are stimulating. I'm wondering if you could please expand on them. Specifically, do you have a first principles argument for how objective journalism is possible? Or is it more an argument using game theory, that if journalists admit objectivity is a fraught proposition, worse sources will rush in to fill the space of truth?
Well, that's an interesting question. No, I believe that the original idea of objectivity, it has become warped. The idea seems to be that objectivity means, on the one hand, on the other hand, stupid, mindless balance, which is not right, which is not a way to do good journalism, but also was not what the idea was. The point that Walter Lippmann and other journalists were making in the beginning of the 20th century, when they were arguing for objectivity, was not that people can or should be completely neutral. They acknowledged that people had presumptions and assumptions that would might inform their work. The point was to carry out scientifically rigorous investigation and observation, rigorously challenging your own assumptions, recognizing your own assumptions, and reporting against your assumptions, so that your readers would feel comfortable at the end that you had given them all the information that you had found, whether or not it was information that conformed to your own ideas and beliefs. So it was a method. It was not a stance. It was a method of doing good, serious journalism with empirical verification at the heart of that project. That still is valid. The question of, we've all become much more conscious of the idea of what subjectivity means and how that fits in, and how that can change how people approach different stories. I'm not denying that that's a part of it, but what I want to emphasize is that the work of verification, the work of empirical observation is still valid, and to think of it in those terms.
So Andie, I'm going to take the last question as my prerogative, and someone who is a great admirer of this book. What do you hope this book does in the world? Do you journalists read it? What do you want for this book?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yes, I want journalists to read it. I want journalists, in part, as to challenge them to think carefully about how fake journalism fits into the media ecosphere, to watch out for it, to think carefully about the role of objectivity and possibly rethink that. I would also love news consumers to read it and to have an idea of how to approach journalism. A lot of people have ideas about how journalism works that aren't really what goes on in a newsroom. And sometimes they're very surprised when they discover how journalists actually work. Sometimes it's, it's scary. It's like making sausage, but sometimes it can be enlightening to know the decisions and the standards and the conventions that go into how to write a story. And I would like people who are not familiar with journalism to have a sense of how it works.
It's been great talking to you, Andie. I've enjoyed every minute.
Thank you, Kathy. Your questions were wonderful. I really appreciated the care that you took in reading and preparing. So thank you. This was fun.
This was such a wonderful event tonight. Thank you both so much. If you'd like to purchase what is the title of the book? Not Exactly Lying. There we go. If you'd like to purchase Not Exactly Lying, I've put the link in the chat. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to our audience for spending your evening with us. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, keep reading and have a great evening. Good night, everybody.